What I'm presenting on today isn't actually connected to my PhD research. It's a proposal I'm developing for a postdoctoral project using crowdsourcing to map organised crime flows in West Africa. I've primarily been connected to crowdsourcing professionally. I've been involved in a few projects that have been mapping particular flashpoints and using crowdsourcing to do that. And through that, I've developed an interest in how this could be used to generate data, particularly on conflict and post-conflict situations. And so that's what I wanted to draw out today, is some of the challenges that I've been confronting when using this. And so what I'll do, how I'll work through this is, initially I'll provide a bit of a background on crowdsourcing for those of you who aren't that familiar with it as a methodology. I'll then talk about why it's useful for researching conflict and how it overcomes some of the challenges that currently exist for researching conflict situations. And then I'll briefly provide an overview of the project that I'm interested in doing, but I don't want to go into it in too much detail. I really just want to use that as a platform to flesh out some of these methodological, logistic and ethical problems with using crowdsourcing data. So crowdsourcing has really emerged from the humanitarian industry as a way of drawing attention to particular flashpoints. So it draws on the growing accessibility of technology throughout the world. Mobile phone access is now considerable, particularly in the developing world. I did some fieldwork in Sierra Leone for my current research, and I took a £10 Nokia phone that, because the battery lasts forever, and a lot of local people laughed at me because it was such a low quality phone compared to what is used locally. So the access to technology is just so much better. So it really relies on the fact that most people are able to text or even take photos of incidents as they're occurring, and they can be posted online. And so this is really the idea of crowdsourcing, that people can report incidents in real time, either through SMS, Twitter, or email, or logging onto a particular platform. And so we're getting access to conflict situations as it's occurring rather than after the fact. And so this is one of the platforms that's used to map some of these incidents. So this was the website created by Uchaguzi for the Kenyan elections in March 2013. And so the idea is that people SMS in incidents, and so there's categories on the right-hand side there of what people are witnessing or experiencing, and then they're plotted on this map. So anybody can access this and see what's happening at the time of the election. It includes positive events as well as negative events, but the idea is just putting the information out there so that people know what is going on. But there is also an action component to it. So I was actually involved in this project this year. And so one of the things that I was involved in was looking at some of the urgent SMSs that were coming in of people reporting, say, violence at polling stations or other incidents that could be addressed. And so we were passing the information on to either the police or humanitarian agencies that were able to actually address the situation. So as well as providing data about incidents, it is also connected to action. And of course, this is just one example. Crowdsourcing has also been used quite commonly in disaster responses. So this is a website developed around the Haiti earthquake to monitor some of the incidents that were happening there. Amnesty International has been using satellite technology actually to map some of the human rights violations that have been going on in Syria, and so connecting this with the experiences of people on the ground to map what is going on. And it was also used by Invisible Children, actually, as an attempt to map LRA movements in Uganda and the East Africa region, although theirs wasn't particularly successful. And so I've mainly been looking at here the use of crowdsourcing in either conflict zones or disaster areas where it is used by humanitarian agencies. But there's a wide range of examples of crowdsourcing being used to generate data on particular issues. Another example, in India, there's a website called I Paid a Bribe, where individuals that pay a bribe are encouraged to log on and record what happened. And so in part it appeals to their sense of wanting to perhaps repent for paying a bribe, but it also records what's actually going on. And because it's anonymous, people are willing to do it. Another organisation in Uganda has been using crowdsourcing to map water points. So this is a more practical engagement where they're seeing where there's gaps in access to water. But the reason why I think it's really interesting from a researcher perspective is is that it is generating a lot of data, and particularly from unstable and insecure areas that we might not have access to otherwise. And so these are just a couple of the reasons why I think it's really useful for conflict research. As you all know, conflict areas are insecure, and it's often difficult to get access to the places that you might have an interest in. Often these areas are remote and difficult to access, and there might be issues with governments or militias blocking access or limiting your access to certain areas. And there's also high levels of distrust, which came out in the first presentation. So it's difficult to engage with local people, but crowdsourcing can provide an interface where people are more willing to engage. It's anonymous, so there may not be repercussions for them sharing sensitive information, but also it gives us as researchers an opportunity to access areas that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. And so as a result, crowdsourcing is increasingly being used for research. So these are a couple of examples. In 2010, Posner led a study using satellite imagery to study patronage. In 2011, Zaitsev used Twitter to explore the Gaza conflict. And there's been a few examples where GIS, which is a mapping technology, has been used to map elements of conflict. And so these first three examples are really using information or data that is already out there. So particularly the Twitter example, this is using examples of people's tweets that were put out into the public domain. But the fourth one, I think, is really starting to capitalise on what the benefits of crowdsourcing are, in that they used SMS to track incidents of the conflict in the Eastern DRC. So in this study, Van der Vint and Humphreys used a process of crowd seeding, where they actually identified several villages that they were going to work in, and identified 3 people in each of these villages. Usually it was the village head, the head of the Women's Association, and then someone that was elected by the village. And each week they would be asked to SMS any incidents that had happened in their village. And so this overcomes the problem of accessing individuals because they actually had specific people picked out. But it also creates a dialogue of ongoing data collection. So I think that's one of the first examples of really using interactive crowdsourcing for research. So I just want to briefly talk about the project that I'm proposing. So my current PhD research has been looking at how international organisations have been addressing organised crime after the conflict, primarily looking at Sierra Leone, but within the broader context of West Africa. And one of the issues that I've come across is that there is really a lack of understanding of what the problem is, both in Sierra Leone but also in the broader region. UNODC has produced some statistics on the flows of organised crime in the region, but their statistics are based on seizures and arrests, which doesn't give a complete picture. And so the claims that are made in terms of the impact of organised crime can't be seen as valid because there's not a complete understanding of the extent of the problem. And so these are some of the claims that are made in terms of the impact of organised crime on the region. There's been comments about the links to terrorism, and this has become particularly pertinent now with the conflict in Mali, with AKIM active in the north. There's a potential to fund coups and conflicts, particularly in the West African region that has a history of coups and conflict that is funded through illicit means. The conflicts in Sierra Leone and Liberia were funded very much by the illicit diamond trade and also the illicit timber trade. So this is a big concern for organised crime in the region. There's issues of corruption. The official revenues of countries in the region is still reasonably low compared to the revenues of drug trafficking, which is the primary form of organised crime in the region. So this is a significant concern. There's also been trends of increased drug use within the region, particularly with unemployed youth. And so some of these issues have the potential to undermine the state, but also to undermine the economic development in the region, which is currently growing quite significantly, but organised crime has the potential to undermine this. So one of the things I'm interested in doing is using crowdsourcing to develop a better understanding of what the impact of organised crime is on the region. So one way of doing this is to ask people how they see organised crime affecting the region. And this is particularly interesting because a lot of local, well not a lot, but a significant amount of local people that I spoke to about drug trafficking in the region actually see it as a positive thing. Unlike illicit timber and diamond trade, which is exploiting resources in the country. Drug trafficking is merely transiting the region. It's coming from Latin America into Europe and just using West Africa as a transit point. It brings a lot of money into the region. It also creates opportunities for people that wouldn't otherwise have employment. So it is seen as a positive. So it would be interesting to get a perspective on how local people actually understand the problem, whether it's a positive or a negative, but also what the impact is, if they're seeing corruption, if they're seeing money being directed to terrorist groups. So by using crowdsourcing, I think there's an opportunity to really get at the structural implications of organised crime as understood by people in the region. And it overcomes this challenge of researching a hidden phenomenon, because obviously organised crime networks have an interest in keeping their business hidden. But so although it overcomes some of the challenges we face conducting research in conflict or post-conflict areas, it does pose quite significant challenges that need to overcome. And so this is what I'm working through at the moment in terms of developing this project. So I just wanted to work through some of these now, and I think this is a really interesting opportunity to do this, because we are all interested in research on conflict, and I think there's lessons to be learned from other forms of other methods that are used in conflict zones. So I'd be really interested in your feedback and your own thoughts on this area. So some of the logistical and practical issues result from location and timing. So crowdsourcing provides the opportunity to access a wide area. So humanitarian agencies have been using crowdsourcing to map incidents that generally cover a whole country. So in terms of my project, there is an opportunity to look at either a whole country or the region as a whole. But this obviously creates challenges in terms of how do people know that this is a project, that this is something that they should contribute to. So obviously the extent or the size of the project determines how much work needs to put into getting the message out that this is something people should engage with. Timing is also a problem. When crowdsourcing is used for humanitarian initiatives, it tends to be around a particular flashpoint, such as elections or a disaster that has happened. So there is already momentum generated from this incident. But for research purposes, there's a need to collect data over a longer period. So for something like this, I would want to do, say, a year-long project where I was constantly monitoring people's experiences of organised crime, but that obviously poses the challenge of maintaining momentum and maintaining interest in the project. There's also a number of methodological challenges. The motivations of people is obviously a significant factor. Figuring out why people would contribute. Posing the question in terms of what effect organised crime has on the region, I think would create a lot of interest, because it's appealing to a sense of pride or national pride. And so I think that overcomes some of that, but there is still this issue of maintaining interest in the project. And there's also issues of verification. And this isn't limited to this project. It's common to a lot of research that is based on people's perceptions, and that how do we know that this is accurate? And so in some instances, say the example around the Kenyan election, there were people based on the ground that would go and check particular incidents, but that's a bit harder to do when we're talking about people's perceptions. And so that's one of the other challenges. And it also poses some serious ethical challenges. Crowdsourcing generally, when people report an incident, they are anonymous, but with any technology, there's potential for hacking, and people's identities could be revealed, which is, puts them in danger. One of the things I've considered is working in partnership with local organisations, which can enhance verification, but also publicising the project. And there's potential that they would be at risk as well for being associated with the project. So that's a serious issue. Another consideration is co-option by law enforcement. If people are reporting on actual incidents of organised crime that they've witnessed, what does that mean in terms of law enforcement? I wouldn't want this project to be some form of tip-off line that was feeding information to the police, but is there a responsibility in terms of having that information to do something with it? And then I think the final issue that I wanted to raise is this tension between research and action. And I think this arises not just in this project, but in a lot of research in relation to conflict zones. But crowdsourcing has this, because it's come from the humanitarian industry and there is this expectation of action, where do we draw the line between data collection and putting that to use? So if there is data, say for instance in the Kenya example, when there is data generated about particular incidents that can be acted on, there's obviously a responsibility to do something about that. So where does that line of where we are a researcher stop and move into advocacy or even humanitarian work? So those are some of the challenges that I'm working through, and I really appreciate your feedback. Thank you.